Hello again, friends, and welcome to another fantastic science fiction story. In this episode, I'll be telling you the tale of the clumsy human Jack and the alien Queen Sofia. The story is very enjoyable, so don't forget to listen until the end. Enjoy watching. The alien queen had never smiled in her entire life, but a clumsy human man made her laugh. The palace of the Valen Dominion had been carved, some 3,000 years ago, out of a single mountain of blue-white glacier stone, by artisans who apparently believed that comfort was a moral failing. Its corridors ran on for miles, lit by veins of cold luminescence that pulsed in the walls like the last thoughts of a dying star, and every surface had been polished to a mirror finish, so that anyone walking through it was accompanied, always, by a slightly warped reflection of their own nervous face. It was a place designed to make you feel small. It succeeded with terrifying efficiency. At the heart of it, on a throne of fused meteoric iron, sat Queen Sofia, and the throne, it must be said, looked more comfortable than she did. You have heard the stories. Everyone in the 7-star clusters had. The queen who never smiled. The white-skinned sovereign whose face was carved from winter marble. Whose grief had calcified into something you could sharpen a blade on. Whose only visible concession to the existence of joy was a rumor, unconfirmed, that she had once nodded approvingly at an execution. The long, delicate points of her ears, the single feature that marked her people as something older and stranger than the humans who traded with them, never so much as twitched with amusement. Her courtiers had a saying, "The queen's face is the weather report, and it always says winter." They had stopped trying to change it. The last court jester to attempt a joke in her presence had, according to legend, been reassigned to the moon that the Dominion used primarily for storing ice. Since then, the court had settled into a comfortable, terrified rhythm of saying nothing funny, ever, on pain of relocation. Which brings us, unfortunately, to Jack. Jack was a human, and he was an envoy, and those two facts were connected by the thinnest and most desperate thread of logic in the history of interstellar diplomacy. Earth's diplomatic corps, faced with the task of sending a representative to the coldest and most lethal court in the known galaxy, had done what all great institutions do when faced with a job nobody wants. They gave it to the person who had failed to leave the room fast enough. Jack had been in the corridor. Jack had made eye contact. Jack was now, 3 weeks and one very long cryo-nap later, standing at the entrance to the Valen throne hall in a ceremonial suit that fit him the way ceremonial suits always fit the truly doomed, perfectly everywhere except the parts that mattered. Remember, his handler had told him before the shuttle door sealed. These people executed a man for pronouncing the greeting with the wrong number of syllables. Do not improvise. Do not touch anything. And for the love of God, do not make the queen angry. Jack had nodded, sweated, and immediately forgotten all 3 instructions in the order they were given. The herald announced him in the rolling, glacial tongue of the Dominion, a language that sounded like an avalanche apologizing. Jack stepped forward onto the ceremonial approach rug, a priceless woven thing older than most human civilizations, and promptly caught his boot on its edge. He did not fall. This was, in retrospect, the last thing to go right for several minutes. He merely stumbled, arms windmilling, and recovered with the loose-limbed panic of a man who has just discovered the floor is a suggestion rather than a promise. A ripple went through the assembled nobility. 200 pairs of pointed ears angled toward him like satellite dishes, locking onto a very stupid signal. The queen did not move. The queen never moved. The queen was, as far as anyone could tell, an extremely elegant statue that occasionally issued death sentences. Jack reached the required distance from the dais and opened his mouth to deliver the formal greeting he had rehearsed 900 times on the flight over. The greeting was a masterpiece of appeasement, a thing of syllabic precision. What came out instead, because his mouth had made an executive decision to betray him, was a mangled hybrid that, when later analyzed by court linguists, translated roughly to, "May your reign be long, O radiant one. And also I have brought you a small horse." He had not brought a horse. The silence that followed had physical mass. Somewhere in the back of the hall, a very old courtier appeared to be praying. Jack, sensing that the greeting had perhaps not landed, decided to salvage the situation with a bow, the deep, sweeping, ceremonial bow he had definitely practiced and definitely not forgotten the mechanics of. He bent at the waist. He kept bending. His sense of balance, already on thin ice, filed its resignation. He pitched forward, one hand shooting out and catching the edge of the banquet table, which sent a golden goblet, full, ceremonial, and belonging to the Dominion's treasury, sailing off the edge in a graceful arc of ancient wine before it clanged against the mirror-polished floor with a sound like a small church bell falling down the stairs. Jack froze, half-bowed, clutching the table, one boot still tangled in the sacred rug, and looked up at the throne with the expression of a man watching his own funeral from a good seat. And then the Queen laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was not a controlled, sovereign, this is mildly amusing laugh. It burst out of her, startled, helpless, entirely unguarded, one pale hand flying to her mouth as if to physically catch the thing that had escaped after being locked away for a lifetime. The sound rang through that frozen hall, bright and warm and utterly foreign, bouncing off 10,000 years of polished stone that had never once been asked to reflect anything like it. The court did not react. The court could not react. The court simply stared, 200 nobles struck into perfect immobility, several of them visibly wondering if this was a trap, and whether laughing along would get them sent to the ice moon. And Sofia, hearing her own laughter for the very first time, feeling it in her chest like a bird beating against a window it hadn't known was open, slowly lowered her hand. She looked down at the bewildered human still clutching her banquet table, wine pooling around his boots, and felt something beneath all that winter marble shift, quietly and dangerously, toward the light. By morning, the story had metastasized. This is the natural life cycle of court gossip everywhere in the galaxy. It is born small, feeds on speculation, and by dawn has grown large enough to have opinions of its own. The version circulating through the glacier stone corridors of the Valen Palace by first light held that the human envoy was no envoy at all, but a sorcerer, a psychic operative of Earth's shadow government, a man who had come armed with an alien technology so insidious it could reach into a sovereign's chest and squeeze laughter out of her like juice from a fruit. How else, the courtiers whispered behind their high collars, do you explain it? 3 decades of winter, one clumsy human, one goblet, and then that sound. It was not natural. It could not be natural. Someone would have to be blamed, and the leading candidate was the man who had done it. Jack, meanwhile, had spent the night in a guest chamber that was technically not a cell, but shared with a cell every important architectural feature. Lying awake on a slab of luminescent stone, the Dominion apparently considered a bed, and running through the many creative ways his career, and possibly his species' entire diplomatic future, had ended the previous evening. He had reached the part of the spiral where he was mentally drafting his apology to Earth's ambassador. Dear Sir, regarding the goblet, and also the horse I promised but did not deliver. When the guards came for him, they did not speak. Valen guards were selected, as far as Jack could tell, for their ability to project the exact quantity of menace required to make a man walk anywhere they wanted without touching him. They escorted him through corridors that grew progressively more private, more silent, more mirror-bright, until his own reflection had become his most familiar companion and his most honest critic. Then a door of white iron parted without a sound, and Jack was deposited into a smaller hall, and the door closed behind him, and he was alone with the Queen of the Valen Dominion. She stood at a tall window carved from a single sheet of transparent ice crystal, looking out over a city that glittered like frost under twin moons. She did not turn around. Up close, without the throne and the distance and the 200 terrified nobles, she was somehow more intimidating rather than less, the way a blade is more frightening in a quiet room than on a battlefield. "Do you know?" she said, still facing the window, her voice the temperature of the view beyond it. "How many people have made me laugh?" Jack, who had learned absolutely nothing from the previous evening, opened his mouth. "I'm going to guess it's a number that ends in a very round 0. "None," she said. "In 31 years, kings have tried, poets, a man who once trained an entire troupe of comic performers specifically for the purpose, I sent him to catalog ice." She turned at last, and fixed him with eyes the pale silver of a winter sky. "And then a human tripped over a rug and promised me a horse, and I lost something I did not know I was holding." "In fairness," Jack said, "it was a very treacherous rug. I've filed a complaint. Well, I plan to." He watched her face for the flinch that meant he had gone too far, the tightening around the mouth that, in every court he'd ever survived, preceded a very unpleasant afternoon. It did not come. Instead, the corner of her mouth did something small and traitorous, and she visibly caught it, stamped it out, and buried it beneath a coldness so practiced it was almost beautiful. "You are here," she said, in the tone of someone changing the subject in a moving vehicle, "because your Earth wants a treaty, trade routes, access to the crystal lanes, mutual defense. Your people are hungry, and mine are strong, and your ambassadors sent me a man who cannot cross a rug without narrating it." She studied him. "I have buried a father, a war, and 3 people I trusted with my life. I do not laugh. I do not warm. I keep my dominion cold because cold does not betray you." A pause. "Do you understand what I am telling you, envoy?" "That the treaty's in trouble," Jack said quietly, the humor draining out of him for the first time. "And last night didn't help." Something flickered behind the winter of her face. Surprise, maybe, that he'd heard the real sentence under the spoken one. "Last night," she said, "did not happen. You will tell no one it did, and you will not do it again." She lifted her chin. "You may go." Jack bowed, carefully this time, a small, cautious, rug-free bow, and turned to leave, and got exactly 4 steps toward the door before his boot found the one raised seam in the floor and he stumbled, caught himself on the wall, and swore softly in a language she did not know. Behind him, Sofia heard it start again, that terrible, unguarded brightness rising in her chest, and she pressed her lips together so hard they went white, and won the war by the narrowest margin of her life. The door closed. The envoy was gone, and the queen of the Valen Dominion stood alone in her cold and glittering hall, one hand pressed flat against her own sternum as if to hold something in, and hated, with the full force of her frozen and formidable heart, how much she was already looking forward to the next time he fell. The official record would later show that over the following weeks, the human envoy Jack was required to remain at court under continuous supervision, owing to the sensitive nature of the treaty negotiations and the demonstrated unpredictability of the envoy's conduct. This was the Queen's phrasing, dictated to a scribe, and it was a masterpiece of the form, technically true, entirely defensible, and a complete lie in every way that mattered. The demonstrated unpredictability of the envoy's conduct required, it turned out, that the Queen supervise it personally. It required long walks through the crystal gardens where nothing living grew but everything glittered. It required that Jack be summoned to explain human customs she could easily have looked up. The court noticed. The court always noticed. But the court had learned long ago that noticing and mentioning were 2 very different survival strategies. "This," Jack said one afternoon, holding up a small silver device, "is going to change your life." Sofia regarded it with the deep suspicion of a woman who had been promised many life-changing things by many men, most of whom had wanted her throne. "It looks like a torture instrument." "It's a harmonica." He put it to his lips and produced a sound that could most charitably be described as a wounded goose expressing grief. Sofia's ears, those long, elegant, treacherous ears, flattened backward in involuntary horror, and Jack laughed so hard he had to sit down on a crystal bench. Okay. I never said I was good at it. You said it would change my life. It has. You're now living in a universe where you know that sound exists. There's no going back for you. That's a burden you carry forever now." He turned the harmonica over in his hands. "My mother gave me this. She said a man should always be able to make at least one noise on purpose that's worse than any noise he makes by accident." He glanced up, sheepish. "I've never once managed it. The accidents are still winning." He said it lightly, the way he said everything, But Sofia had spent 31 years learning to hear the sentence underneath the sentence, and she heard this one land. A dead mother. A gift kept across the void of space. A man who turned his grief into a joke because the joke was easier to hold. She looked at him differently after that, and did not tell him so. It was Sofia who broke first, though she would never have called it that. They were in the high observatory one night, watching a comet the Dominion had named, in its cheerful way, the Weeping One, when she said, without deciding to, "My father built this room." Jack went still, the way you go still when a wild thing approaches and you don't want to frighten it off. "He was not a cold man," she went on, staring at the comet. "That surprises people." He laughed. He was loud. The court adored him. A long pause, filled with the soft hum of the observatory's ancient machinery. He was betrayed by the three people closest to him. It took them a year to do it and an afternoon to finish it. I was 19. I watched what warmth cost him, and I decided the price was too high, and I've been paying a different price ever since. She finally looked at Jack. "I have never told anyone that." "I know," Jack said quietly. He didn't reach for a joke. That was the moment she understood he knew when not to, that the clumsiness was real, but the man underneath it chose his footing carefully where it counted. "For what it's worth," he added, "I don't think warmth is what got him killed. I think it was the three people. Warmth's just what made him worth having around. Those aren't the same thing, even if they showed up at the same funeral." Sofia said nothing for a long time, but something in the winter of her face had begun, very slightly, to run. Not everyone found this development charming. From a shadowed gallery above the observatory, a man watched the two figures below with the patient stillness of a predator who has learned that the best moment to strike is never the first one. His name was Adrian, and he was the Queen's war minister, the architect of 3 victories and the survivor of every purge since her father's fall. He had served the cold queen faithfully for a decade, because a cold queen is a predictable queen, and a predictable queen is one a clever man can steer. He had positioned himself carefully in her frozen court, a hand near every lever, and now a human had wandered in off a rug and started thawing the one thing Adrian had built his entire future upon. He watched Jack say something, watched the queen's shoulders shift in a way that, on any other woman, he would have called ease, and Adrian's jaw tightened by a single deliberate degree. Below, Jack was demonstrating the harmonica again, and it was somehow worse than before, and Sofia was pressing her hand to her mouth, not to stop the laughter this time, Adrian noted, but only to muffle it. She was letting it out. She was choosing to. That was the dangerous part. A queen who laughed by accident could be dismissed as bewitched. A queen who laughed by choice had made a decision, and decisions could reshape a dominion. Adrian withdrew from the gallery without a sound, his boots silent on the mirror stone, his mind already turning the problem over with the cold efficiency the queen herself had taught the court to prize. The human was not a fool, whatever the court believed, but he was clumsy, and he was foreign, and he had arrived carrying a treaty. And a treaty, Adrian reflected as he descended into the palace's colder depths, was a document, and documents, unlike people, could be made to say absolutely anything. The thing about a well-built trap is that it never looks like a trap. It looks like a Tuesday. The treaty had reached its final form, weeks of negotiation compressed into a single crystalline data slate that held, encoded in its lattice, every clause of the alliance between Earth and the Valen Dominion. Trade routes, crystal lane access, mutual defense. Jack had carried it back and forth between the human delegation and the Valen scribes so many times he had started apologizing to it. On the morning everything went wrong, the slate was scheduled for its final ceremonial reading before the full court, after which the queen would press her seal into it, and 30 years of frost would begin, cautiously, to trade with the sun. Adrian had spent those weeks being helpful. This is the most underestimated weapon in any court, relentless, visible, exhausting helpfulness. He had offered to safeguard the master copy of the treaty in the War Ministry's secure archive, a gesture so reasonable that refusing it would have looked like an insult. He had personally escorted Jack through the encoding process, learning, with the quiet attentiveness of a man taking notes for later, exactly how the human delegation authenticated its documents. And somewhere in the cold machinery of that archive, over the course of a single unwatched night, a second lattice had been written into the slate beneath the first E, a hidden clause, forged in Jack's own authentication signature, in which Earth pledged not friendship but reconnaissance, promising its Crystal Lane access to a rival power and mapping the Dominion's every defensive weakness in exchange for it. It was a beautiful lie. Adrian was rather proud of it. The ceremonial reading began the way all Valen ceremonies began, slowly, coldly, and with an unspoken threat toward anyone who coughed. Sofia sat on her meteoric throne. Jack stood in the envoy's position, having successfully crossed the rug this time, a fact he was privately quite smug about. The chief scribe activated the slate, and the treaty's clauses rose into the air as glowing script, and the court read along in the reverent silence of people watching history. And then the hidden lattice unfurled. Jack didn't understand it at first. The script was in the rolling Valen tongue, and he watched the court's collective face change before he grasped why. He saw the reverence curdle. He saw 200 pointed ears angle toward him, no longer curious, but cold. He saw, at the far edge of the dais, Adrian arrange his features into an expression of profound and theatrical betrayal, and something in Jack's stomach dropped through the mirror-polished floor. "And the human envoy pledges," the scribe read, his voice shaking, "the defensive coordinates of the Valen inner clusters in exchange for—" "That's not," Jack started, and the whole hall flinched at the sound of his voice, and he understood, with the awful clarity of a man watching a door close from the wrong side, that there was no sentence he could finish that would land as anything but a confession. "It bears his signature." Adrian's voice cut through the hall like a blade drawn slow. He did not shout. He never shouted. "Authenticated, human encoded. I safeguarded this document in my own archive precisely because I did not trust it, and I see now that my caution was—" He bowed toward the throne. Grief and loyalty performed to perfection. "Insufficient. My queen, he made you laugh so that you would not look at his hands." It was, Jack would think later, the cruelest true-sounding thing anyone had ever said about him, because it wasn't the accusation of espionage that struck the court silent. It was that last sentence. It reframed every warm thing they had all pretended not to notice. The walks, the observatory, the wretched harmonica, as strategy, as a long, patient con. And the terrible genius of it was that Sofia, who had spent 31 years knowing that warmth was the thing that got you killed, had been raised her whole life to believe exactly this. She looked at Jack. And Jack, who could read the sentence under any sentence, watched the winter come back into her face in real time, watched it climb up from her jaw and freeze the light out of her eyes. And it was worse than any death sentence because he understood that she was not choosing it. She was retreating into the only shelter she had ever been given. Her father's lesson, arriving right on schedule, 31 years late, and exactly as promised. "Sofia," he said, "just her name. Not my queen. Not Radiant One." And that was a mistake too, because the intimacy of it, in front of the entire court, only made the con look more complete. "You will address the throne correctly," she said. Her voice had no temperature at all now. That was the terrible part. Rage would have been warm. This was just cold. "Envoy, you will be held in the West Archive until the human delegation can be summoned to account for this. The treaty is void." A pause, and for a single flickering instant something moved behind the ice, something that might have been the memory of a comet named the Weeping One. And then it was gone, stamped out, buried the way she had buried everything else. "Take him." The guards came. Jack did not resist. There was nothing to resist against but a document that told a better story than the truth. As they turned him toward the door, he caught Adrian's eye, and Adrian permitted himself, the smallest possible smile. The first genuine smile, Jack realized bitterly, that anyone in this frozen court had shown in weeks. And Jack finally understood the whole shape of it, too late to be believed by anyone who mattered. The white iron door closed behind him. In the great hall, the court exhaled its scandal in a long, satisfied hiss, the old order clicking back into place like a bone reset. And on her throne of cold iron, the queen of the Valen dominion sat perfectly still, perfectly sovereign, perfectly alone, and did not smile, and did not laugh, and looked for all the world exactly as she had before, a clumsy human ever tripped over a rug, except that now she knew precisely what she had lost, and the knowing was a kind of winter all its own. Winter is very good at some things. It preserves, it clarifies, it strips a landscape down to its bones so you can see the shape of what was always there. And Sofia, alone in her cold hall for 3 nights after the human was taken, discovered that the same was true of a mind stripped of warmth, with the harmonica silenced, and the walks ended, and the whole thawing business firmly frozen back over. She could think again with the terrible clarity that had won her a war at 19, and the clarity kept snagging on the same splinter. He made you laugh so that you would not look at his hands. It was a good line. It was too good a line. Adrian had delivered it the way a man delivers a line he has rehearsed. And Sofia, who had watched 3 people she loved rehearse their betrayals a lifetime ago, knew the cadence of a prepared truth from a spontaneous one. A guilty man scrambles. Jack had not scrambled. Jack had said her name. And a man running a 30-year con on a queen's affections does not, in the moment of exposure, throw away the con by using her name in front of 200 witnesses. He clings to it. He performs innocence. Jack had performed nothing. Jack had simply looked at her like a man watching the one warm thing in his life close a door. So the queen of the Valen dominion did what she was very, very good at. She went cold, and she went hunting. She did not summon the human delegation. She summoned the slate. And rather than trust a scribe, she took the lattice apart herself in the deep archive, layer by crystalline layer, through a long silver night, because her father had built the observatory. But he had also taught her, before the end, how the Dominion's oldest data lattices were grown, and grown things carry their history in their rings. The forged clause was flawless in its content. But it had been written a full lattice generation after the rest of the treaty, 9 days after. And Jack's authentication signature, perfect as it was, had been applied not by a living human hand, but by a replay of a stored key, the kind of key that only existed in one place in the entire Dominion. The War Ministry's secure archive, the one Adrian had so helpfully offered to safeguard. Sofia sat very still in the cold blue light and understood the whole architecture of it at once, the way you suddenly see the second image hidden in a puzzle and cannot unsee it. A cold queen is a predictable queen. She had heard the sentence he never said aloud, the way she heard every sentence, and this one had been playing under Adrian's loyalty for 10 years. He had not feared the treaty. He had feared the thaw, because a queen who could laugh was a queen who could no longer be steered, and Adrian had built his entire future on a hand near every lever of a woman he believed would never move. She had one problem. She had proof, but proof was a document, and Adrian had already demonstrated with exquisite cruelty exactly how much a court would believe a document over a feeling. If she accused her war minister of forgery, he would produce a reasonable, helpful, devastating explanation, and the court would once again choose the version with the tidier signature. She needed him to reach for the lever himself in front of everyone, believing it still worked. Which was where, against every expectation including his own, Jack turned out to be useful. She had him brought from the West Archive in the dead of night. Not freed, not yet, just brought. And when the guards deposited him in her cold hall, he took one look at her face and said, "You've got the specific expression of someone who's about to make me commit crimes." "I have proof Adrian forged the clause," she said. "I cannot use it. He will out-explain me. I need him to expose himself." Jack, to his enormous credit, did not gloat about being right. He sat down on the cold floor, uninvited, because his legs apparently had opinions about 3 nights in an archive, and he thought about it. He safeguarded the slate because he doesn't trust anything he can't hold in his own vault, he said slowly. So, don't give him a document to explain. Give him a witness to silence. Tell the court that before I was arrested, I recorded a full deposition. Everything I saw about who had access to that archive. Backed up off-world in the human delegation's ship, unsealing automatically at dawn unless I stop it. He looked up at her. There's no recording, but he doesn't know that, and a man who forges evidence can't imagine anyone bluffing without it. He'll move to reach the delegation's ship before dawn, and the only reason to reach a recording that doesn't exist is to destroy one you're afraid does. Sofia stared at him. That is either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. Those are usually the same plan viewed from different ends, Jack said. Ask me at dawn. She announced the deposition to the court at first light, coldly, as a formality. She watched Adrian's face do absolutely nothing, which was itself the tell. A man with a clear conscience reacts. A man with a buried one goes carefully blank. And that night, the Queen's silent guards, positioned by Sofia herself, took the war minister of the Valen Dominion as he attempted to breach the human delegation's grounded ship, a stolen archive key in his hand, the very key, the only key, that could have replayed Jack's signature 9 days after the treaty was signed. He did not out-explain that. There is no reasonable, helpful reason to be standing inside an ally's ship at midnight holding the instrument of your own forgery. The court, which had so eagerly hissed its scandal at Jack, now watched its architect dismantled by his own reach, and found, as courts always do, that it had believed the other version all along. Adrian, held between 2 guards in the cold hall where he had performed his grief so beautifully, looked at Sofia with the flat hatred of a man whose life's work had been a single wrong assumption. You were supposed to stay frozen, he said. I know, Sofia said. And for the first time in the entire affair, standing sovereign and terrible and entirely dangerously warm, the Queen of the Valen Dominion very nearly smiled. She did not let it out. Not here. Not for him. She was saving it. The disposition of Adrian was handled, as most Valen justice was, with a coldness that would have frightened Jack a great deal more if it hadn't been aimed at someone who'd tried to frame him for interstellar treason. The Queen did not send him to the ice moon. That, she observed dryly to Jack, would have been a promotion, since the man clearly enjoyed cataloging things. Instead, he was stripped of his ministry, his rank, and his careful decade of leverage, and dispatched to administer the Dominion's most distant and least consequential agricultural moon, a place where the greatest threat to the realm was a fungus, and where a man who had built his whole future on being near the levers of power would spend the rest of his days being near a great many potatoes. It was, the court agreed in appalled whispers, somehow the most terrifying sentence she had ever handed down. Mercy from the Winter Queen was scarier than any execution, because nobody knew the rules of it. The treaty came next, and this the whole court expected to die quietly of embarrassment, the way scandal-touched documents usually did. Instead, Sofia had the forged lattice publicly excised, peeled away in front of the full assembly so that everyone could watch the lie separate from the truth beneath it, which turned out to be an unexpectedly useful piece of theater for a realm learning, all at once, that documents could lie and feeling sometimes couldn't. What remained when the forgery was gone was the actual treaty, the one Jack had carried back and forth until he'd started apologizing to it. Trade routes, crystal lanes, mutual defense. Earth, hungry. The Dominion, strong. She pressed her seal into it herself, and 31 years of frost began, at last and in earnest, to do business with the sun. Earth's ambassador sent a formal message of gratitude and a quietly baffled follow-up inquiry as to how, precisely, the envoy who had promised the Valen Queen a non-existent horse had ended up single-handedly securing the most favorable interstellar treaty in human history. Jack composed several dignified replies and sent none of them. The truth was not a sentence he knew how to write to a superior. He was preparing to leave. His job, technically, was done, when Sofia summoned him one final time to the cold hall, where all of it had happened. He crossed the ceremonial rug flawlessly, which felt like a small betrayal of everything, and stood in the envoy's place, and waited. "You could stay," she said. Not a command. He noticed that. From a woman who had spent her life issuing commands because they never left you vulnerable the way a question did, it was the most exposed thing she had ever said to him. "As what?" he asked, gently. He was giving her the room to retreat, and she knew it, and she looked at him with those pale winter eyes, and for the first time in her sovereign life, chose not to take the exit that was offered. "I have spent 31 years, she said, "believing that the warmth is what got my father killed. You told me in the observatory that it wasn't, that it was the three people, and the warmth was only what made him worth having around, and that those are not the same thing even if they show up at the same funeral." She stepped down from the dais. The queen came down off her throne, and the court, had it been there to see it, would have needed to sit down, and stopped in front of him. "I did not believe you then. I have had recent occasion to test the theory." It held. A breath. "The betrayal came from the cold, Jack, not the warmth. It always came from the cold. I built a fortress against exactly the wrong thing, and it took a human who cannot walk across a rug to show me I had spent my life guarding the door, while the danger sat inside it wearing the face of loyalty." "In my defense," Jack said, because someone had to say something, and his mouth had a long-standing policy of volunteering for these moments. "The rug really is treacherous," she finished. "Yes, I've had it removed." And then, in her own cold hall, before the great transparent window where twin moons hung over a thawing city, the queen of the Valen Dominion did the thing that 31 years of kings and poets and a doomed troupe of comedians had never once managed to draw out of her. She smiled. Not the startled, helpless bark of laughter from the banquet escaping against her will. This was slower, deliberate, a thing she was choosing to let out and to keep out, watching his face the whole time to see what it would do to him. And it undid him completely. This careful, radiant, chosen warmth on a face that the entire galaxy swore was carved from winter marble. "There it is," Jack said softly. "That's the one they said didn't exist." "It existed," Sofia said. "It was only waiting for someone clumsy enough to knock it loose." He stayed. Of course he stayed. The human envoy became the human consort, a development the court adjusted to with the specific horror of an institution discovering its queen intended to be happy in front of it, and which it eventually came to tolerate and then grudgingly to enjoy. Because a laughing court, it turned out, executed far fewer people over syllable counts. Jack never did master the harmonica. The accidents kept winning, and Sofia kept laughing at everyone. And somewhere along the way, the sound of the queen's laughter stopped being a rumor and became simply the weather. Not winter anymore, something with a sun in it. Years later, when a young courtier nervously asked how the Winter Queen had ever come to thaw, the palace historians would offer the official version, full of treaties and forgeries and the fall of a war minister. But the servants who had been there told a better one, and it was true, and it went like this. Once, a clumsy man tripped over a rug and promised a queen a horse he did not have, and made her laugh for the first time in her life, and she had spent every day since making sure he never had a reason to stop. For 31 years, an entire galaxy agreed on a single fact. Queen Sofia could not smile, and they were wrong, not because the smile wasn't there, but because they kept sending her their most polished performers, their cleverest words, their most rehearsed charm, when what she was actually waiting for was someone real enough to fall down in front of her. The warmth was never missing. It was only guarded, and she had built her fortress against the wrong enemy, bracing against tenderness, when it was the cold, careful, perfectly mannered loyalty that had been the danger all along. So maybe the question worth sitting with is this one. How many of the people we've decided are cold are simply waiting for someone who won't perform at them? How much of our own frost is a fortress we built against the wrong thing, guarding the door so carefully we never noticed the danger was already inside, wearing a familiar face? and the parts of ourselves we keep most locked away, the laughter we're certain no longer exists. What if it was never gone? What if it's just been waiting all this time for someone clumsy enough and real enough to knock it loose? Winter preserves everything it touches, but nothing was ever meant to stay frozen forever. The end. This concludes Sophia and Jack's story, friends. Before we go, I have a small request. Please hit the like button, leave your thoughts on the story in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next story. See you again in the next science fiction adventure. Goodbye.